Paris 13 and 14. A 70-year-old man is shackled to a stake. After 7 years of suffering, his body is shattered, yet defiance burns in his eyes. Grandmaster of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay. To witness him pleading for forgiveness, thousands of people have assembled. Rather, he takes an unexpected action. He declares the Templars innocent, retracts all of his confessions, and curses King Philip IV and Pope Clement V to suffer God's wrath within a year. If a heretic withdraws, they will burn alive. The fire has been ignited. They ascend methodically and gently. He never screamed, according to witnesses. He cursed again till his lungs were filled with smoke. 33 days later, the Pope passed away. The monarch 8 months later. Is it a coincidence? People have been whispering about the Templar curse for 700 years. The 10 most horrible execution techniques employed by medieval executioners are about to be revealed. Techniques intended to prolong death for several days. This is what actually occurred, according to Obsidian Chronicles. Every week, we uncover the tales that history attempted to hide, the executions that your professors never brought up, and the penalties that are too graphic for textbooks. Click subscribe if you think historical truth should be presented and censored, since what follows will be much worse than what you've heard thus far. First, let's address the fires. The stake served as more than just a means of execution. It was a ritual and religious performance intended to show the Church's supreme authority over the body, the soul, and death itself. Fire cleanses. That was the theory. Fire purifies the corrupted soul while destroying the heretical body, using hardship to give sinners one last chance at salvation. However, this is what you are not taught in history class. In theory, the Catholic Church prohibited its clergy from spilling blood. Canon law was particular. Burning thus turned into the ideal workaround. Holy flames carrying out God's job without a blade or blood. Wearing a yellow robe adorned with flames and devils, the condemned were marched through the streets. Stones, rotten vegetables, and trash were thrown by crowds. The victim was already bleeding and battered when they arrived at the public square. They were shackled to a wooden post that was vertical. Instead of ropes, used chains. Ropes burned too fast. They were surrounded by chest-high stacks of wood and straw. The executioner then started the fire. This is where things start to get really unsettling. Expert executioners were expert artisans. They were members of guilds. They spent years training. They were experts at building fires. Relatively immediately, a fast-moving, hot fire killed. Dry, dense wood. Sufficient ventilation. Superheated air was inhaled by the victim. Lungs burned. The airways were closed. Asphyxiation death within 10 to 15 minutes. However, it was a slow fire. A slow fire that was purposefully built. A smoldering greenwood. Wet straw that produces little heat but smoke. Insufficient ventilation. The sufferer gradually burned. First the feet. Legs, then thighs, skin blistering, splitting, then charring, fat turning beneath the flesh like candle wax. According to reports, the stench was intolerable. Witnesses described it as roasting pork combined with a chemical or caustic substance. Strong man threw up. The victim would call out to God, scream, beg, and ask for water. Before death eventually arrived, some people went insane from agony. It could take 3 to 4 hours to put out a sluggish fire. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc, Orleans' maid, perished in a fire at Rouen. She was a 19-year-old peasant girl who led armies, scared English commanders, and claimed that God had spoken to her. Her fire was long-lasting. Before the smoke eventually hushed her, witnesses said she screamed out to Jesus 6 times. She was conscious and burning for a long time, as evidenced by her 6 distinct cries. That evening, her executioner sought out a priest because he was so troubled. He claimed to have burned a saint and expressed his fear. Joan was found not guilty 25 years later. She was canonized 500 years later. However, she burnt that May morning in 1431 to the applause of an English mob. On February 17, 1600, Giordano Bruno, a mathematician and philosopher, was burnt in Rome. His offense implied that stars were far-off suns and that the universe was boundless. His tongue was attached to his jaw, a metal spike through skin and muscle before they started the fire, preventing him from speaking heresies as he passed away. In constrained silence, he burned. However, his concepts endured. Over the course of 5 centuries, more than 50,000 suspected witches perished in this manner. But hold on, things get worse. Death was insufficient for high treason in England. The severity of the offense had to be reflected in the punishment. Quartered, drawn, and hanged. Each step was explained in clinical detail in the entire phrase. The condemned were made to stand and hear the details of their impending demise. The traitor was first stripped and bound to a hurdle, which is a wooden frame. It was pulled through the streets by horses. Exposed flesh was torn up by cobblestones, stones, trash and animal waste were thrown by crowds. The victim was already bleeding from numerous wounds by the time they arrived at the execution site. Sometimes the skin was torn, the bones were fractured, and they hung till they were almost dead but not to death. The executioner was cautious enough to choke them till they were on the verge of death, but not enough to kill them. Still breathing, still conscious. The condemned were chopped down. Mutilation followed. The victims' genitalia were first severed and burned in front of their eyes during castration. Their screaming demonstrated that they were still awake. The drawing came next. As the victim observed his own organs being removed from his body, the executioner cut open the abdomen, reached inside and delicately removed the intestines. The guts were instantly burnt. The stomach came next. The man was kept alive as other organs were removed. The last organ removed was the heart. Lastly, quartering and beheading. The body was divided into 4 sections, preserved by boiling them in salt, and then placed on spikes all around the realm. The Scottish rebel William Wallace was put to death in London in 1305. Records show that Wallace did not lose consciousness until his intestines were being burned. He was reportedly still moving his lips, according to witnesses. When the executioner eventually reached for his heart, some people prayed. On London Bridge, his head was positioned atop a spike. Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth received his quarters. Fighting for Scottish independence was his crime. In 1606, Guy Fawkes suffered this penalty. Torture had weakened him, but before the worst could happen he was able to jump from the scaffold and break his own neck. He showed himself a little mercy. At least hanging, drawing, and quartering ultimately resulted in death, but this penalty was still permitted in England until 1870, the 19th century, when railroads were already traversing the countryside. The next technique was intended to keep you alive for several days. I have a question for you now. What worries you the most out of everything you've heard so far? The public gutting of William Wallace or the flames that burned Joan of Arc alive? Please leave a remark below. We're not even halfway through, so tell me which approach keeps you up at night. And animals are used in the following technique of execution. An execution that was intended to cause the greatest amount of misery and visibility was developed by the Holy Roman Empire in France. The wheel that breaks. The convicted were stripped nude and bound spread eagle to a big cartwheel, the kind used for heavy farm wagons, that was positioned horizontally on a wooden scaffold elevated above the throng. Everyone had to witness it. That was the whole idea. The executioner came with a heavy iron bar, often referred to as a breaking bar and other times just the iron, a one-use tool. The methodical devastation of the human body ensued. First, the ankles. The executioner carefully positioned the bar, raised it, and used deliberate, exact force to bring it down. Witnesses reported that the sound of the little ankle bones breaking reverberated around the square. The foot, which was just joined by skin and tendon, flopped carelessly. Then the wrists, the same exactness, the same nauseating crack. The tibia and fibula of the lower legs come next. Here several blows are required. Beneath the epidermis the bones broke into pieces. The strongest bone in the human body is the forearm, followed by the thighs. The strongest blows were needed for this. There are occasionally several executioners operating in shifts. The upper arms come next. And lastly, the rib cage. The executioner fractured each rib separately, painstakingly, one after the other, pausing in between. Allow the victim to scream, allow the audience to take in what they were seeing, and allow the lesson to become clear. Some executioners treated their task as normal, drinking water, wiping their brows, and conversing with officials. Every hit was designed to cause the greatest amount of suffering and the least amount of sudden death. The executioner purposefully avoided striking the head, spine, or major arteries. A body that was totally destroyed was the aim. Even though every significant bone broke into pieces, the person was still breathing, living, conscious, and aware of everything that was going on. The doomed damaged limbs were weaved through the wheel's spokes, threading broken arms and legs between wooden spokes like some hideous work of living art. When the breaking process was finished, which may take more than an hour, then the wheel was placed vertically on a tall pole so that everyone in the square could easily see the broken body high above the throng. There, the victim was abandoned to perish from exposure, shock, dehydration, organ failure, and birds that would land and start consuming their flesh while they were still breathing and observing. It can take days to complete this process. 2 days was typical. 3 days were recorded. According to reports, some victims endured more than a week on the wheel, unable to move a muscle, unable to pass away, and helpless to do anything but endure agony in the scorching sun or bitterly cold rain. Jean Cullei was a 64-year-old Protestant businessman in Catholic France who was put to death in 1762. He was not guilty at all. His kid had taken his own life. John was charged with murder by the authorities. The trial was absurd. Even as every bone broke, he remained innocent. He took more than 2 hours to pass away. Voltaire looked into it for years. Jean Cullei was formally cleared 3 years later. Nevertheless, he had passed away while screaming at the wheel. Sometimes justice doesn't come at all, and other times it comes too late. A psychologically horrific punishment created by the ancient Romans was brought back to life in medieval Europe. The penalty of the sack, known as the Poena, is only applied to parricides who murder their own parents. The condemned were put inside a sealed leather sack or barrel after being beaten and having their heads covered with a wolfskin bag. But not by yourself. They were joined by 4 creatures. A dog is a symbol of unfaithfulness. Unnatural behavior is symbolized by a rooster. A viper represents cold-blooded betrayal. A monkey that represents ridicule of people. After being sealed, the barrel was dumped into a river. Eventually, drowning was the cause of death. However, something worse arrived before. Complete blackness. Total darkness. You couldn't move your arms in such a small area. 4 fearful, frightened animals that were trapped, dying, and desperately biting, scratching, and clawing. The viper kept hitting. The dog was chewing anything it could get its hands on. Flesh is being torn by the ruer's talons. The barrel tumbled in the torrent, water seeped in, air rushed out, and the monkey screamed and clawed. Screams were reportedly audible through the shut barrel, according to witnesses, till they abruptly stopped. Drowning, however, happened really quickly. Minutes of horror. The next steps might take days. And 500 years later, people are still afraid of the man who developed it. Although he did not create impalement, Vlad III of Wakia refined it. Transformed it into a terrifying art form. He is known in history as Vlad the Impaler. A wooden stake that was sharpened but not overly so was carefully chosen. Instead of severing organs, you wanted it to push them away. Oiled to facilitate easy travel. The victim was placed face down. After being entered, the spike was gradually forced through internal organs until it came out of the shoulder. The stake was positioned in a vertical orientation. Raised and impaled, the victim was on display. The remainder was done by gravity. The weight of the body gradually forced it down the hill hour after hour, inch by inch. The victims were conscious for long stretches of time. Others became insane, others prayed, some pleaded for death, and some were able to talk. Blood loss, organ failure, and shock were the final causes of death, but they were never immediate. In a single campaign, Vlad impaled more than 20,000 Ottoman prisoners. Positioned around his capital in concentric circles. A withering woodland that stretches for miles. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, noticed that forest as he arrived with his troops. He headed home after turning around. The image was too much for even the conqueror of empires to bear. Soldiers would throw up just from the stench. Vlad didn't save impalement for anyone who annoyed him, including political competitors, thieves, adulterers, and foes. He would eat amid the impaled corpses and see their demise while he did so. Vlad had a nobleman impaled on an extra tall stake after he complained about the stench, so he would be above it. The objective was terror more than just execution. And it was effective for decades. Crime decreased to nearly nothing. Gold could be left along the path of the street by merchants. Everyone was aware of the penalty, but even Vlad had his limitations. One approach was so drastic that historians disagree as to whether it was ever utilized. The response is more unsettling than you may imagine. Some techniques were so horrible that historians cannot agree whether they were genuine or just a threat. There are 2 types of sawing in half. With their legs splayed, the victim was hanging upside down. By keeping blood flowing to the brain, the inverted position prolonged consciousness considerably. A 2-woman timber saw was positioned at the groin and pulled into the torso. The sufferer could see everything, feel their body being bitten by fangs, and see blood gathering beneath their upside-down head. Victims were said to stay conscious until the saw reached the navel, sometimes even farther, due to the posture. Only after the saw split the thoracic cavity did death occur. Set aside for particularly egregious offenses. Severe blasphemy. Treason. Its presence is confirmed by historical examples. It is mentioned in legal documents. We may never know for sure if the next technique is common or uncommon, but it was formally approved. It was approved by Parliament itself. Poisoners were subject to a specific punishment in England. Cooking killed you and cooking will kill you. An act authorizing boiling death was passed by Parliament in 1531. A big cauldron that is filled with boiling water or oil. The condemned were progressively lowered in. The flesh cooks instantly in the feet first, then the legs and finally the torso. The victim is crying and pleading as third-degree burns spread upward. The executioner wouldn't release his grip until it was chest deep. Total immersion. Death in a matter of minutes. However, the practice was outlawed in 1547 when Richard Roos, a cook accused of poisoning a bishop's family, was boiled alive at Smithfield in 1531. Extremely brutal, even by 16th century standards. We're not finished though. There are still 3 approaches. Everybody managed to personalize death. 3 other techniques are worth discussing in depth. Each offers a unique perspective on the brutality of the Middle Ages and the ability of humans to cause pain. The methodical peeling of skin off a living individual is known as fleeing. The victim was unable to move an inch due to total restraint. Using a thin, razor-sharp blade, the executioner started at the extremities, first the fingers, then the hands and finally the forearms. Working slowly and methodically inward, the skin was carefully peeled away in sections. A skilled practitioner could remove large pieces entirely intact, much like removing a glove. The procedure proceeded inward, starting with the arms and legs and ending with the torso, the back and the chest. Eventually, shock, blood loss, and the ensuing infection caused death. However, sufferers could spend hours feeling everything, being completely aware and being cognizant. Even lengthier claims are made by certain accounts. The commander of the Venetian garrison in Famagusta, Cyprus, was Marco Antonio Bergardin. He agreed to a negotiated surrender to Ottoman forces in 1571 after an 11-month siege, ensuring his men's safe exit. The deal was broken by the Ottomans. 4 days, Bergardin was subjected to torture. His nose and ears were severed. He was thrashed by soldiers and had to carry bulky loads of dirt. He was then flayed alive in the public plaza on August 17, 1571. It took hours to complete. According to reports, he prayed and was aware until the executioner got to his waist. Dressed in his military uniform, he rode a cow through the streets as his skin was filled with straw. It was eventually sent as a trophy to Constantinople and put on display in the armory. The skin was eventually found by Venetian operatives in 1580, over 10 years later. It is currently housed in a shrine within the Venice Church of St. Giovanni a Paolo. Precipitation, a more straightforward technique, involves being hurled from cliff faces, city walls, castle towers, and other heights. Sometimes the fall results in quick death, and other times it falls onto rocks or sharpened stakes. Everything came to an abrupt end when it struck the ground. At times it didn't. While multitudes watched from above, victims would survive the initial fall with broken legs, a broken spine, and a cracked head. They would then lie dying slowly for hours. Just waiting, unable to move, unable to pass away swiftly. The 30-year conflict began on May 23, 1618, when Protestant Bohemian lords, acting via 2 Catholic imperial governors and their secretary, dropped more than 70 feet from the windows of Prague Castle. After surviving, the Catholics ended up in a heap of dung. They said they were saved by angels. Not everyone who fell from a height was as lucky. Lastly, the cage that is referred to as gibbeting in England. Iron cages that resembled human bodies were suspended from bridges, city walls, church towers, and castle gates. The condemned were imprisoned inside, sometimes with space to sit, sometimes made to stand, and sometimes unable to move at all. They were then left there to perish from dehydration, exposure to the elements, heat in the summer, cold in the winter, and birds that would land on the cage and start pecking at exposed flesh while the victim continued to breathe and observe for days or weeks. After that, the body was kept in the cage for months or even years, and occasionally it was reduced to just bones that rattled in the wind. A lasting message to anyone who would think about committing similar actions. These techniques were all public, drawn out, and intended to frighten. Execution was viewed as cosmic restoration in medieval civilization. The crime was accelerated by the offender's suffering. Such violence indicates something unsettling about human nature, and their suffering balanced divine scales that Christian civilizations built on mercy and forgiveness practiced. The inconsistencies were not concealed. They received religious authorities' blessings, legalization, and institutionalization. It wasn't until philosophers questioned whether states should torture citizens to death during the Enlightenment that the movement to outlaw cruel punishment gained traction. These techniques are shocking to us now. They should, but they also serve as a reminder that moral advancement is neither permanent nor inevitable. When severe cruelty is permitted by law and supported by ideology, societies are able to justify it. They weren't viewed as monsters by the executioners. They were carrying out their duties, obeying commands, and returning home to their families. Maybe the most unsettling thing of all is that. Subscribe to Crown and Dagger if you think historical truth should be told and censored. This is what actually occurred. I'm Crown and Dagger. However, there were other people who were adept in prolonged death besides medieval executioners. An empire existed that gave the impression that these techniques were harmless. The Assyrians. Impalement seemed compassionate in light of what they did to adversaries. Do you want me to share that tale? Tell me in the comments. And if you've read this far, please hit like, so I know you're interested in stories like this. I'll see you in the upcoming historical nightmare.